Okay, we're going to start the first module after spring break. This is Module 6, where we're going to focus on women and children and primarily the violations of rights where women and children are concerned. So we're going to focus in on the topics of slavery, bonded labor, and trafficking. So we're going to deal with slavery to begin with, and we're going to focus on both domestics and bonded labor. We're also going to talk about sex trade and sex trafficking, and as this graphic shows, 13 years old is the average age of children in the sex trade around the world. And within the sex trade and trafficking topic, we'll talk about sexual slavery, prostitution, and sex tourism. So let's just start by talking about slavery in general. What is slavery? How might we define slavery? And I provided a definition here that it's the formal but not always legal denial to individuals or groups of a particular freedom to have control over their lives. And so some issues to consider are slavery as an institution. It is an institutionalized, formal aspect, again, not legal, but it's become an institution within societies, both in history and today. And then what is the relationship between slavery and race? How has that changed over the centuries? And then what are the conditions that make slavery even possible and or profitable? And then what is the relationship between the slave themselves as well as those who control the slaves? So let's first break down what do we mean by these different types of slavery. We have unfree labor, so to speak, where we think about chattel slavery. This is a traditional slavery that we think of in terms of ownership, what happened in the United States, for example, during before the Civil War. So chattel slavery is a traditional form of slavery that we probably think of most often where we're talking about ownership of a particular individual. And then there's debt bondage. This is the idea that you are going to be a laborer as some form of payment or for a loan. And we see this a lot, particularly in developing countries, where parents will actually loan out their children for money. And so the child would be indebted, a bonded laborer for that particular individual. And if we go further into the literature about slavery, Patterson in 1982 developed a typology, if you will, that said there's some universal common features of all types of slavery systems. And so I'll just list those for you. First, the master has the right to threaten or punish the slave with violence. That's a feature of slavery that Patterson points out. Second, all slaves experience what he calls natal alienation, meaning that they are denied rights at birth. Then all slaves are deprived of honor. That should be pretty self-evident. But what might be missing from these features, other features that are common but not universal, include that slaves are exploited for the purpose of economic gain. So in African societies, slaves were used to increase the number of dependents of the master, which then served to increase his status but may not result in direct economic benefit. And sometimes slavery was not always associated with ownership. Until Roman law, there was no real concept of absolute property. So we cannot assume that all slaves are ethnic, cultural, or territorial others, since there have been some examples, rare, obviously, of enslavement within ethnic groups. But basically, Patterson says there's some common universal features, that there's this punishment element, that slaves are alienated and denied rights of birth, and that all slaves are deprived of honor. A second study by Bales and Robbins in 2000 also has a list of common features. And again, some of these are very similar to Patterson, where he argues a slave is controlled by another person. So here we have that control element is a key component of slavery. Secondly, the owner appropriates the labor power of the slave. Here is the economic component, the idea that the owner appropriates, takes over whatever power the slave has in terms of their labor. Thirdly, the slave's activities are controlled by the threat or use of violence. So not only is the slave controlled by the person in terms of their total life and their lifestyle, the slave's activities are controlled because of the threat of violence. And that these they apply these features to the different types of slavery. Okay, so Bales and Robbins has breaks down into some different types of slaveries, and so I will mention those for you now so that you can jot these down. There's white slavery, forced labor, debt bondage, child prostitution, forced prostitution, sexual slavery. All of those satisfy the three common features that Bales and Robbins talks about. That the slave is controlled by another person, number one. Number two, that the owner appropriates the labor power of the slave. And then number three, the slave activities are controlled by the threat or use of violence. Those are the three common features, that the slave is controlled by another person, the owner appropriates the labor power of the slave, and the slave activities are controlled by the threat or use of violence. So for Bales and Robbins, white slavery, forced labor, debt bondage, child prostitution, forced prostitution, and sexual slavery all satisfy those three common features. Prostitution, the use of migrant workers, they argue, sometimes satisfies all three, but not always. Forced marriages involve the threat of violence, but not always the other two. Apartheid, incest, organ harvesting all involve the threat of violence, but none of them involve the appropriation of labor power. And then, of course, they say the caste system may involve violence, but not always. So when we're talking about slave and slavery, the types of slavery are immense, and the types of violence used in these different types of slavery vary. All right, let's just do a little bit of background on the history of slavery. Most studies focus on American slavery, that is chattel slavery, as it existed before the Civil War. So early studies focused on slavery as an institution and were cast in the light of what is called the white man's burden. The idea that the white man must take care of those who were of different color, of a different race, of another ethnicity. So whether it was a white man's burden with the United States and slaves in the States, or whether or not it's a white man's burden as the United States embarked on some imperial efforts after the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, for example, it was cast in this idea of the white man's burden. And so slavery was an economic institution. It's a means of social control. And needless to say, these pro-slavery arguments obviously fell out of favor moving forward. So this, again, focus on American slavery and then this idea of the white man's burden. Elkins in 1959 wrote a piece where he discusses four major legal categories which define the status of the American slave. And first there was the terms of servitude. And so for the terms of servitude for the American slave, it was for life, and it passed on to all the descendants. A second category is the marriage and the family. In the mid-19th century, meant that for the purpose of upholding ownership rights, slaves were denied the traditional securities and assurances of family life, and no marriage was actually recognized by the law. A third category that defined the American slave was the police and disciplinary powers over the slave. So Southern states adopted a paternalistic attitude in hopes of avoiding unnecessary ill treatment. But we know, of course, that slaveholders were responsible for what we call today gross human rights violations. And then the fourth legal category when it comes to the American slave really focused on the property and all other civil rights, the types of rights that we've discussed in this class, and slaves had no such rights. But if we go back even before the American experience into history, slavery was part of the ancient world. In Greece and Rome, there were war slaves, household slaves, common or chattel slavery. If you moved up, obviously many centuries in the Latin America and the Caribbean, in the 15th century there was the establishment of the transatlantic slave links connecting Western Europe and West Africa and the New World of the Americas. So slavery was linked to European expansionism and colonialism. So Europeans were exposed to slave systems and their exploits in Africa and transported that to the New World. And there was attempts at enslaving the Native American population, but these generally failed. Native sensitivities to the diseases brought by Europeans and the abundance of Africans made this mortality rate a less significant factor. So the Europeans that came to the United States, or what was the Americas at the time, passed on the attempts of enslaving the Native American population, focusing more on the African slave trade. And in the Latin America and the Caribbean, they worked, slaves did, on sugar and coffee plantations, as well as those types of plantations in the British colonies of North America. Portugal brought the slave system to Brazil, so we have slavery all in the Western Hemisphere. But if we think about slavery in the United States, much of this is information you probably already remember or know from your American history courses, that the British originally tried the native population, and then they tried indentured labor from England, Scotland, and Ireland. But the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. But the question of servitude was not defined in law until 1660. So in order to attract more white settlers without fear of being indentured, certain rights were established for them, but were not extended to black workers. So what started as an informal practice was quickly institutionalized based on racial discrimination. And then if we move through history into the abolitionist movement, the driving force for the abolition of slavery as it's practiced in the West came from the British. So the ban on the slave trade really started to gain momentum from the 18th century onwards through the intellectual circles and university students in Great Britain. So British Parliament bans the slave trade in 1807, with the formal British system ending in 1838. And so the British become the global champions at ending slavery. And in 1815, the Declaration relative to the universal abolition of the slave trade condemned the practice and called upon all states to declare slavery illegal. And so this movement, the abolitionist movement, was associated with the Enlightenment and other religious movements in the such as the Quakers. Britain, however, didn't live with slavery every day, as was the case in the United States. So in the United States, the movement came mainly from northeastern states. According to Elkins, the anti-slavery movement was unique in the United States since it was wholly moral in its outlook. The role of individualism in America didn't align with the system of slavery, and then slavery as a sin was also manifested. And so the forms of slavery, however, continued after the Civil War in various parts of the world. So in the United States, the Enlightenment, the Quakers, the northern states all aligned themselves with the abolitionist movement that really started with Great Britain, and then the Civil War ultimately ended slavery as an institution in the United States. However, we know that the different forms of slavery have continued all over the world. All right, so if we think about global slavery, the practice of slavery was declared illegal by passing the League of Nations Slavery Convention in 1926. The UN Convention replaces it with a protocol in 1953, entering it into force in 1955. And then we have in 1957 the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade Institutions and Practice Similar to Slavery. This activity declared slavery a criminal offense. And of course, slavery is also addressed in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, where this covenant right here, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, talks about the right to work and to receive fair wages. And the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights addresses unfree labor. And then the Rome Act of 1998, which created the ICC, defines slavery as a crime against humanity. And so that's one of the issues that the ICC is taking up in terms of their mandate. Then finally, we have some UN documents that deal with slavery with children, which brings us to this concept of new slavery. So we're going to focus on new slavery, and this is excerpted in your text from Kevin Bales's Disposable People. And here the focus is on control rather than ownership. So Kevin Bales suggests that there are over 27 million slaves today. He believes that at least 17 million are bonded laborers in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And so you can find this on page 9 or so, or about 3 or 4 pages into the excerpt in your book. And the second largest group are in Southeast Asia, and then you have North and Western Africa and parts of South America. But it's important to note that there are slaves in major North American and European cities working primarily as domestics. And this is a big problem for Houston, which is part of the route for the sex trafficking and slave trafficking in the United States. The new slaves, as Kevin Bales calls them, work in the agricultural sector. They're manual laborers. They make bricks, they mine, they make carpets, they make jewelry. They're in the cigar and cigarette industry, and we know they're in the in the sex industry as well. And so when it comes to race, it means much less in the new slavery. What matters, according to Bales, is production. He says how much work can be squeezed out of each individual. And so we're going to focus in on one particular type of this new slavery, at least when we're talking about women, and that's a trafficking of women. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about comfort women and then sex tourism. What I want to talk about first is a comparison side by side of the old versus new slavery. So if we think about the old form of slavery, what you have is legal ownership. There's a high purchase cost, but person by person, studies have indicated that there's actually a low profit margin. There is a potential for the shortages of slaves under old slavery, particularly after the British started to enforce the ban on the slave trade. In the old slavery, there was a long-term relationship between the slave and the slave owner. And so there was this effort to maintain the health of slaves. And the ethnic differences or the racial differences was key. When we think about new slavery, people don't want to own the others. They want to actually avoid that. There's low purchase cost but high profit. The whole idea is how to get the most amount of money out of the slave, and since most of these individuals are trafficked, they're not purchasing individuals like they did in the old slave markets. There is an endless supply of potential slaves. These are all short-term relationships, and I think, as the reading points out, slaves are disposable people, hence the name of Kevin Bales's book. And here, ethnic differences are not as important. What's important is the economic ability, or what the person in control can get out of the slave in terms of a profit. All right. Well, let's just talk about women as the target of abuse. And so we can think about one place to start is war crimes against women. And for a long time, there was no specific crime against women during warfare. But now, part of the ICC's mandate is that there are war crimes when it comes to women, and rape has been classified as one of those war crimes. But back before World War I, there was an event called the Rape of Nanking. And so I've got 3 different links here for you that you might consider looking at. The first is a web page, and I'll bring that over, that describes what happened. And this is from the Gendercide website, which obviously they talk about gendercide. So if this is one of your topics, this might be a source for you. But the Nanking massacre happened in the 1930s, and this is also known as the Rape of Nanking. And so here you have a gendercide against women and men. I want to make that clear, but we're going to focus on the women. And so this is where Japan has invaded China through Manchuria, and then we have women are killed indiscriminately. They're executed, but a large majority died after extended and excruciating gang rape, as it is written here. So this is the episode that I want to focus on. And so here you can read a brief outline of that particular event in history. The second link that I have here, I wanted to just show you briefly, and this is an example of a multimedia project that might be of interest to you as you're putting together your project. And so this is one way to do your actual presentation should you wish. And so this one is lengthy. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but this is a YouTube video of the Nanking massacre, and I'll just show you a few of the well, I didn't mean to do that. I'll just show you a few of the minutes of it so that you can see how this was a group project, and how you could, for your particular project, the next element of your semester project, present your particular topic. So hopefully we can get this to roll. Okay. Goodness.
It's July 7th, 1937, and war has broken out between the Japanese and Chinese. It is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Let's look at the events leading up to the war.
Japan was a greatly imperialistic nation, and it wanted to have a great empire like Britain. Japan had planned to dominate China for some time. Conspiracies of taking over China began even before the turn of the 20th century.
In 1931, Japan officially invaded China, commencing their long thought-out plans of invasion. War didn't break out though. Japan struck at a very opportune moment, as the Chinese were having internal conflicts and revolutions at that time.
The Japanese started their invasion of Manchuria, located in northeast China. After Manchuria, the Japanese traveled west, moving through the rest of China, participating in several mini engagements. These engagements were small battles fought between the two sides. War still hadn't broken out.
On July 7th, 1937, the mini battle known as the Battle of Marco Polo Bridge occurred. This engagement was not small like the ones before, and it started the war between China and Japan. The Second Sino-Japanese War finally broke out as a result of this battle.
After the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese citizens knew they were definitely in trouble, as the Japanese military was much more skilled than the Chinese. In November, 4 months after the start of the war, the Japanese had captured the busy
Okay,
city
so
of Shanghai.
I'll end that just to
Upon capturing Shanghai, the Japanese
just because you can watch that at a different time, and eventually they get to the specific events of the actual massacre and go into detail about the brutality of that. But that's just an example of how you might think about doing your multimedia, your presentation. It doesn't have to be multimedia. Obviously, your semester project can be a PowerPoint. So, but there's no limits on that. And then this is a interview with a author. Her name is Iris Chang, and she is writing about the actual events of the Nanking.
Are we talking about the
massacre.
story in the article itself?
Well, the story about him now is a shrine in
Well,
his doctor's
he's a
office.
doctor now, and he feels so terrible about what he did. So he has put pictures of I guess some of the atrocities in the waiting room of his clinic. And so patients of his can see what he did in Nanking.
Let me read just a little bit from what you've got in your book. I remember being driven in a truck along a path that had been cleared through piles of thousands and thousands of slaughtered bodies. Wild dogs were gnawing at the dead flesh as we stopped and pulled a group of Chinese prisoners out of the back. Then the Japanese officer proposed a test of my courage. He unsheathed his sword, spat on it, and with a sudden mighty swing, he brought it down on the neck of a Chinese boy cowering before us. The head was cut clean off and tumbled away on the group as the body slumped forward, blood spurting in two great gushing fountains from the neck. The officer suggested I take the head home as a souvenir. I remember smiling proudly as I took his sword and began killing people. Why'd you obviously this bothered you. Why did you put this in there?
I wanted to show people that the Japanese soldiers were inculcated to commit violence. This is not a story that was an isolated incident. I mean, this was happening throughout Nanking. And they massacred people all the way up to the capital, and they even held killing contests in order to desensitize the Japanese soldiers from feeling reluctant in committing these atrocities.
Got a picture here of corpse.
Okay, so you can see that whole interview with the author Iris Chang, who did a lot of research for her book about the Nanking Massacre. And a very sad footnote to this is that Iris Chang committed suicide shortly after this particular book was written, after falling into a pretty deep depression, as you might imagine from some research she did related to this and other types of human rights violations. But I show you those to give you a sense of the devastation of this particular event. And so if we kind of think historically what is happening here, the Japanese invade China. Nanking is a provisional capital at that time. I'm sorry, as of 1928. And so in December 1937, the Japanese are making their way across parts of China in what is known as the Rape of Nanking. And so you had 300,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians killed, and then 20,000 women raped, and then they were brutally murdered afterwards. And so throughout some of the historical documents that were found, many Chinese were beheaded, as was just described by Iris Chang in her book. And so these are depictions of that particular atrocity. During the entire Japanese occupation of China, an estimated 10 to 30 million Chinese died during that particular time period. And so this is a mountain of bones found at this particular massacre site in Hubei province of China. All right, so that's one incident. If we move forward during the war, this is where the next article, or one of the articles in the text, the military comfort women. This is a Watanabe article, and this is where you have an institutionalized form of sexual violence that is not uncommon around military installations. Military installations during this time period, and even today, there is a pretty thriving prostitution market going on. There is sex slavery in this particular area around military installations around the world. And so if we think about what's going on in this particular instance, you have the Japanese Imperial Army, and I'm reading from the Watanabe article here. The article talks about that the army divided comfort women into a hierarchical order according to class, race, and nationality, and then according to the rank of soldiers they were made to serve. Korean and most other Asian women were assigned to lower class soldiers. Japanese and European women went to high-ranking officers, and most of the European women were Dutch, who were imprisoned in the prisoner of war camp in the Netherlands, East Indies. Okay. And so the majority of the women that the Watanabe article is focusing on are Korean women. and about 80% of the approximate 200,000 women that were considered sex slaves were Korean. And then 30% of those women survived the war. So we know that race and ethnicity played a role. And just like in the article before the spring break where we talked about Asian values, we tend to think, I believe, from the Western perspective of Asia as this big monolithic group, when in reality there are a lot of racial and ethnicity divisions in East Asia, and particularly between the Japanese and Chinese and between the Japanese and the Koreans. And so, as I mentioned, Korea and most other Asian women were assigned to lower class soldiers during this time period. And so what is the motivation for these comfort women? And so the reading talks about, and I'm quoting here again, to arouse this soldier fighting spirit by providing them with an outlet for their frustration, and this it was fostered by the hierarchical military life. And this was also, they wanted to prevent the raping of Chinese women, which is what happened in the Nanking massacre. And so learning from that experience, if you will, the Japanese really focused sex slaves on non-Chinese Asians. And so, of course, the article goes into how it was that these women came to speak later and give testimony by sex slaves of the Japanese military. And so they were silent for so long because of social social morals, if you will, within the Korean culture. And so this idea of shaming, much like we think about rape victims today, there was a lot of shame involved in not wanting to be known as a victim of a rape crime. And so they kind of felt like they lost their identity, and then they have their cultural norms that they're trying to adhere to. So we think about what is being done. This is the effort by the international community and the Japanese government. So they initiated a private fund to compensate wartime Asian comfort women forced into sexual servitude for Japanese soldiers. And so there is this remuneration, if you will, for those particular women involved. And there is this connection to sex tourism today. Sex workers, military men are replaced by businessmen. There are sex tours that gentlemen can go on as they travel across the globe. And so that it really is a continuation of the commodification and dehumanization of women and their bodies. Here is some pictures of comfort women being trucked to Japanese camps, and some additional women that were found by the U.S. Army. And you can see that this particular woman is pregnant, which was not uncommon. When the war was over during the Tokyo War trials, these particular trials did not deal with the enslavement of Korean women. And so this is Tojo waiting to be sentenced during that particular war crimes trial. But we do know today that at the ICC, in particular after the Bosnian Wars in the 1990s, rape did become a war crime in today's environment. And so the women in 2000, there was a war crimes tribunal on Japanese military sexual slavery, and these are the women who in 2000 were part of the testimony during that tribunal. And if we think about trafficking today, and then we'll take a quick break, you can see the countries of origin are in red, where is a very high number. So you have trafficking of Chinese, Eastern European is not uncommon, of part of Southeast Asia, and then we have some trafficking of individuals from Latin America, India, And so we can see that, and then where are they heading? These are the countries of destination in the blue. So here we are, not uncommon to have sexual slavery on the coastal regions of the United States, and then they're brought inward, and then brought into Turkey, Japan, Western Europe. This is Germany. And so trafficking is alive and well today, unfortunately. All right, we're going to take a break there, and then we'll come back and finish up talking about women and human rights violations.